Hello and welcome. My name is Ffion Parry and thank you so much for joining me today to listen to my presentation. I will be focusing on the deaf and hard of hearing community and their experiences in accessing support services. Before we begin, some of you may already know some basic sign language, which is fantastic, but for those of you who don't, here are a few British signs that might be useful for you. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, thank you, and goodbye. So before we begin, here's a little bit about me. I graduated from Bangor University in 2020 after completing my degree in health and social care, criminology and criminal justice. And I decided to stay on for my postgraduate studies. And I am now a second year student on the MSc Theories and Counselling course. Now, as part of this course, it's required that we conduct a research project focusing on a chosen topic. As someone who has grown up in a household with a sibling who has a severe disability, my childhood and upbringing has been very different to my peers, and that understanding that each individual lives a life as complex as the other intrigues me. And having already written a dissertation in my undergraduate degree focusing on family life and their experiences of living with a child who has a disability, I was eager to broaden my understanding of other experiences in a different topic. This is where the idea came to research the experiences of individuals from the deaf and hard of hearing community. I had very little knowledge on the topic prior to this project. However, I quickly realised that there's very limited deaf awareness amongst society. Now, just a little bit of background research. Before conducting the research plan, it was necessary for me to read up and familiarise myself with everything that I might need to know before conducting this project. Now, deafness is a disability which is thought to affect over 5% of the world's population, and it's estimated that 1 in 10 people will be impacted by some level of hearing loss by 2050. Now, with its prevalence, I assumed that funds would be available to research the topic, yet it's estimated that in 2018, less than 1% of the total public and charity investment into medical research is actually spent on hearing research. Now, its prevalence and limited research raises concerns on treatment and inclusivity for individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing. Previous research on the deaf and hard of hearing community specifies in the variations of hearing loss, type of communication methods used, and the preferred terminology, and the most commonly reported issue individuals experience. Barriers are discussed in literature, however, they focus on why and how the barriers occur, such as lack of awareness and education amongst professionals and availability of interpreters. Now, it seems that effort has been made to reduce the barriers through interpreters and written communication amongst service providers and service users. However, ethical challenges and the reliability of these interventions are questionable. And through reviewing the current research, it is evident that there is a gap in the literature. Now, through viewing the current and past papers on the subject, it became evident quite quickly on the importance of terminology amongst the community, as seen when writing the deaf and hard of hearing. Writing deaf and hard of hearing, the use of lower and uppercase D is used. Now, the term deaf with lower d, lowercase d, is generally used to signify a person who's developed their hearing loss before the development of speech and language, and will tend to describe their hearing loss in medical terms, and often use English as their first language and lip read as a method of communication. And they also may use hearing aids. Now, the term hard of hearing tends to refer to individuals with hearing loss ranging from moderate to severe, and often communicate through spoken language and use assistive devices such as cochlear implants and hearing aids. Now, the term deaf with uppercase D is often used by individuals whose preferred form of communication is sign language, and will use it as their first language. And individuals who identify as deaf often have a strong deaf identity and describe themselves as part of a culture and a linguistic group. They also tend to not perceive their deafness as a medical disability. Now, moving on to my own research question, the research intends to fully understand the barriers that individuals from the deaf and hard of hearing community access when they access support services. There seems to be a firm understanding that barriers are among all aspects of life, though research fails to understand these barriers from a personal perspective, which provided me with a clear area that needed to be explored. Now, the need to identify these barriers that individuals experience and the importance of integrating these needs with effective strategies and interventions are ever growing, specifically in the current world where masks are worn to prevent coronavirus, which causes further barriers in communications for those who communicate through lip reading. Now, this has paved the way to me forming my research question: how do individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing experience accessing support services? I also formed two hypotheses about this study. The first being the majority of the deaf and hard of hearing participants will report experiences of barriers within support services, and the majority of the deaf and hard of hearing participants will not agree that support services are inclusive for the deaf and hard of hearing community. Now, participants were recruited through social media websites such as Facebook and Twitter, and we also used the student participant panel system in the School of Psychology, where they were asked to partake in an online questionnaire to gather data on their experiences of accessing support services. Now, the inclusion criteria for this research were that all individuals were over the age of 18 and they were deaf and or hard of hearing. Now, this study used an opportunity sample method as the recruitment process, and it also adopted a mixed method approach to address the main research question and to test both hypotheses. Now, both hypotheses were tested using descriptive analysis, and then they were then supplemented by informal thematic analysis to analyse the qualitative data. The results were concluded from the multiple questions that were asked to the participants through the online questionnaire. Now, these questionnaires were designed to incorporate descriptive questions to ensure that the participants engaged fully with the research, allowing them to explain their experiences as accurately as possible. The results analysed from the questionnaire supported both hypotheses and can be presented in two sections. The first being barriers and challenges faced. Now, as seen in the chart below, 69% of the participants reported experiences of barriers whilst accessing these support services. And these included communication and understanding issues, refusal of entry to assistant dogs, and the limited use of the Accessible Information Standard, which is a requirement for services such as the NHS. The second section focused on the inclusivity. Now, as seen below, participants were asked whether they agree that support services are inclusive to the deaf and hard of hearing community. 7 reported yes, definitely. 6 reported yes to some extent. 5 not really. 5 definitely not. And 2 decided that they would prefer not to say. Participants then also suggested that services lack inclusivity due to phone-only appointments, no text facilities, and the National Health Service operating clinics through shouting patients' names to gain their attention. The results suggested there to be a distinct lack of inclusion and a multitude of barriers within the support services. Now, to accompany the results, suggestions and recommendations were made to further support the inclusivity of support services for the deaf and hard of hearing community. These suggestions and recommendations made by the participants varied. However, the most common theme were for all service providers to undertake deaf awareness training to better their services, be provided lessons to learn British Sign Language, or to be given the appropriate sign language interpreter for better communication. Now, as suggested by past studies and confirming both hypotheses outlined in this research, the recurrent theme found communication difficulties to be the most prevalent barrier, and these issues are known to lead to social problems such as isolation and exclusion. These included lack of deaf knowledge, phone call conversations, and mask wearing. Other barriers found within the study were accessibility and the use of accessible information standard. This meant refusal to services due to assistant dogs and the denial of relevant information. Inclusivity and the satisfaction of services were also themes discussed, such as phone call appointments only, the limited option to use text or emails, and the lack of sign language interpreters. Now, recommendations such as live chat services, more active email communications, the implementation of the accessible information standard, again, deaf awareness, lessons in British Sign Language, and more sign language interpreters are all suggestions made by the deaf and hard of hearing community. Now, this study has provided a small insight into what it means to be deaf and hard of hearing whilst accessing these services. Some negative and some positive comments, but these recommendations and suggestions will provide a baseline for any future review of services. Now, to move on to the strengths and limitations of this project, the expectations regarding the number of sign-ups were much less than anticipated. Prior to the data collection, the research proposal suggested that the research aimed to test an opportunity sample of 200 participants. And once the data collection began, it was evident that the number of sign-ups would be greatly smaller than anticipated. Due to the small sample, it is difficult to determine whether the outcome is a true representation of the population, though nevertheless the research does provide sufficient descriptive focus, and although small, all the responses are purposive and focuses on relevant and rich information to provide a firm understanding on individuals' experiences. This focus further supports previous studies on the type of barriers that may occur with first-hand experiences and challenges. And as mentioned previously, the recommendations and suggestions made will support services to eliminate these barriers if used in future and will be used in the future review of services. Future research into this topic should take into consideration the main themes reviewed in this research, specifically those that have limited research on, just to further explore the issues surrounding the barriers. Now, due to the unexpected limitation to the sample size, it limited the research generalizability, and what future research could do is focus on obtaining more participants to provide a larger scale descriptive analysis. This could be done through reaching out to charity organisations, counselling services, larger scale organisations such as Mind.org, International Disability Alliance, and online forums. It may also be worth taking into consideration the possibility of further data collection, such as interviews, where the recommendations and suggestions discussed could be utilised and tested. Through the review of this research and recommendations for future research would be to ensure all participants understand the text of the questionnaire. Now, as mentioned previously in the project, research shows that sign language, whether it be British Sign Language or American Sign Language, has its own distinction from written and spoken English. Therefore, communicating through written text may not always be effective for all participants. So, to conclude this PowerPoint, although it was a small study, there's been clear correlations to previous research in the topic, and what this research has done is provide additional first-hand experiences and challenges to support that lasting research. Now, through focusing on individual experiences, the work has provided future researchers, members of the community, support services, and organisations an insight into what is needed for inclusive and accessible support services for the deaf and hard of hearing community. Recommendations and suggestions will support services to eliminate any barriers that the deaf and hard of hearing community experience. Now, the results have the potential to provide prospects for change where needed and help prevent further exclusion and encourage inclusivity in all support services. Now, the take-home message might seem simple and obvious, yet if the knowledge from this research can provide anything, I think it should be to be kind, be aware, and be patient towards all members of society. No one knows what another individual might be going through, and no matter your profession, a counsellor, a mechanic, a shop worker, a teacher, becoming more aware of others will help create a more inclusive world. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my presentation, and I will be available to answer any questions in the comment section. Thank you so much.